Success Insight shares the stories of the people with passion and drive who make things happen in the world. Here's your host, Howard Fox.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Success Insight podcast. Our guest today is Nick Braccia. Nick is a Cannes Lion and Clio winning writer, director, and producer. He has had a hand in developing some of the most influential viewing experiences on TV, including shows like The Outcast, Sense8, Watchmen, The Man in High Castle, Westworld, and The Purge. Now, Nick is the author of Off the Back of the Truck, Unofficial Contraband for the Sopranos fan. How about that? Off the Back of the Truck immerses fans further into the world of Tony Soprano, offering an in-depth analysis by Nick and his consiglieres. I hope I got that right. And is the must-have but didn't know you needed companion guide to the award-winning television series, The Sopranos, and is a necessary prelude to the upcoming prequel, The Many Saints of Newark. Nick, such a pleasure to have you on the Success Insight podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Howard. Really thrilled to be here.
I have to admit, in the spirit of full disclosure, when The Sopranos was on TV or on HBO, I did not subscribe to HBO. So everything that I know about The Sopranos came from almost after the show was over. Mm-hmm. And in the days of COVID that we're in right now, we spend a lot of times, or I spend perhaps more time than I should, watching YouTube videos, and many of those YouTube videos are select scenes from The Sopranos.
Oh, yeah, I do the same thing.
Yeah, and as I was introduced to you and to your work, and I have been reading the book, I have learned so much more about what goes into producing a television show and a blockbuster genre-defining television show than I ever realized. And so I would love, as we start to get into our conversation today, really kind of understand what led you to want to write this book about The Sopranos, and what is it about your background that kind of helped to inform this wonderful book, Off the Back of the Truck?
I think Paul McCartney saying it's a long and winding road. That's what took me to this book. I've had a creative marketing career for over 2 decades. And part of, I think, what's made me somewhat successful there is that I'm always pulling from other aspects of my life, and always, to use kind of an archaic term, moonlighting in different fields, pursuing different interests, and working to build bridges between those and my quote unquote day job. And through that kind of approach, I often feels like stumble upon some pretty incredible opportunities. So it's almost like my loose philosophy and the way that I approach things, whether purposeful or not, has turned into something of an ethos. I stay busy, and these things find me where I'm able to apply my skills and interests and take chances. To get specific, the real focus here and what led to the Sopranos book, Off the Back of a Truck, is I grew up in the tri-state area, and there's lots of tri-state areas I know nationally. The one I'm talking about is New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, where there's a lot of similarities, both in terms of immigrant cultures, in terms of the way that class breaks down, everything. If you put a big dot on Manhattan and go 45 to 75 minutes out in any direction, there's specific Connecticut culture, Jersey culture, Long Island culture, Rockland County culture, all that stuff. But there's also a connective tissue and through line. So that's the world I grew up on. And the show came out it premiered in 99. So I was 1 year removed from college, really just starting my adulthood. So it was resonant. And I had, being an Italian American, being tri-state area, it was like, oh, this has my attention. With respect to film and TV, growing up, I went to public school through 8th grade and then to a Jesuit all-boys high school, followed by a Jesuit college called the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. There, I made lots of great friends, but also met a man who would become my mentor. He was my film professor starting my sophomore year. His name's Steve Weinberg. And I always had loved movies and TV as a kid. Of course, the Lucas and Spielberg stuff, but also things like Twin Peaks, where I really started to understand what my taste was, what my aesthetic was, what my sensibility was. My parents are civil servants. I grew up in a loving, active, sports-oriented household, but it wasn't like, let's all go to the ballet. We weren't going to like Indian art house movies, but this whole new world opened up for me in college through Professor Weinberg, Steve, and these friends of mine. The short version is I learned how to read and understand cinematic, filmic language, how to analyze it, how to write on it, how to express myself and have conversations around that. And it enriched me in the true liberal arts sense. And I've always kept those muscles and worked those muscles through relationships with friends, through keeping in touch with Steve, through writing, and through my work on understanding and working to market entertainment properties. A lot of getting called in 2 years before HBO airs Westworld, with the agency Campfire I was working for, to help HBO understand how to position and sell and communicate what Westworld's about to people. That all goes back to learning and understanding the material first, being able to communicate tone and theme, things like that. So you develop these skills and you're not like, oh, I'm going to quit my job and write TV criticism because there's like only 6 people I think get to do that in the world at this point. It's not a job, but it's funny because I used to work at Simon & Schuster, the publisher of this book in the late 90s, but I ended up in a happenstance conversation with a wonderful woman, Teresa DeMasi, who is the publisher of Tiller Press, the Simon & Schuster imprint. We were brought together by a colleague and friend of mine, Sam Ford, who's working on her team. And we ended up in this remarkable conversation about the book. And I think she said offhanded at the time, oh, you should write something like that. And I was like, oh, well, I don't write books, but sure. I thought it was a flattering thing to say. And it was a great and fun conversation. But 3 months later, I got an email that was like, have you thought any more about that project? And I was like, yes, even though I hadn't thought, and I went to their office within a couple of days. My day job has always been selling ideas. I went into this meeting excited by the prospect of, and like I walk into any meeting, it's like, I want to inspire wonder. I want people to feel possibility, and I want to sell this idea. And I did.
What's interesting is off the back of the truck, this is not your typical book about a TV show. A lot of books that I had a writer on in the early days of my podcast, was a writer for Cheers and Seinfeld. And, he talk about, here's the evolution of the comedy, of the writing. And I mean, this is not a book about, okay, here's season 1, here's episode 1, episode 2, episode 3, and so on. I mean, this thing is dissected and through a lot of different lenses. How did that construction, how did that come about? Or did you just blurt it out, let's do it this way? Or how did you kind of decide on the construction? Because that to me, as I'm reading this book, Nick, is really what I find fascinating. I mean, I'm all about food too. And I know you talked about Italian food. And by the way, I love the difference between gravy and a ragu. Because I used to know a guy from Philly area who talked about he's spending the weekend making gravy. And I was like, okay. So thank you. I've been educated on that one. So how did this construction of this book come about? Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And some of it was purposeful, and some of it was the kinds of happy accidents that I find occur if you're producing something and feel comfortable enough to go with the flow. Part of the conception of the book was, and also when I sold this, I'm working a full-time job and have a daughter and have a couple of podcasts. And not only that, I hadn't really written critically for an audience in a while. So I was thinking to myself, The Sopranos Sessions is another book. It's a terrific book by New Jersey, I think Newark Star-Ledger TV critic, and a guy who's written multiple books, Alan Sepinwall, partnering with Matt Zoller Seitz, who's been writing for Vulture and Roger Ebert's site forever. They did that, and I wasn't going to do it better. Like, it exists. If you want an episode guide, The Sopranos Sessions, where they take all of their post-episode pieces that they wrote when the show was on and put them in this great compendium and did extra stuff. That exists. So we don't need another one of those. Also, they're more famous than I am. So if someone's picking between mine and theirs, I'm not going to win. So it was like, what's my angle? And I thought, and also, how can I get this done against the deadline? As a producer, as a writer, as a DJ, kind of radio style DJ, not rave techno DJ, I've always been good at bringing people together and knowing how to hear a room and cast a room and put a party together. And I thought, and I didn't know who the invitees were going to be at first. I was like, if we can get a really diverse group of voices in this book, it's going to feel like a party for fans of the show. Also, there's lots of stuff I can write about, but there's also lots of stuff that I'm not going to be that good at writing about. Like for example, I was really well suited to write about the video game and pinball machine. I was less suited to write about the makeup that the character Danielle from Whippany wears. And not only that, when you cast the book as a party, then in today's social media world, all those other people are just as proud and working just as hard as me to promote the book. And they're all part of this conversation. So I just decided I'm going to foster and throw this book as a party and invite like the 10 to 12 people I'd most like to attend, a real chorus of voices in there, and see what happens. And in that mix, I'd say the core of it, especially for me as I was working through the process of the book, are, three different people who I studied with under Steve Weinberg himself, a guy that acted for Steve at Stanford, Joe Mader, who became my friend later. So like a third or so of those people are from my kind of like core group of folks who I've been talking about TV, movies, and art. I've been talking about, for 25 years with these people. There's going to be natural chemistry, and other people were ones that I've met. Some of them I don't know in real life. I know through Facebook and through reading their material over the years, and just invited them into this party. And it ended up, I think, being pretty well cast. And it gave it, I really didn't want anyone to get sick of my voice in the book. It was a goal. And I think it works pretty well at that.
Yeah, I'm curious, as you're inviting your collaborators, your consiglieres, am I pronouncing
I've heard it pronounced that way. Consigliere is how they do it in The Godfather when they talk about Tom Hagen.
Right.
Tom Hagen was an wartime consigliere, they said.
Okay, so no G sound.
Yes, no G.
Consiglieres. As you're bringing this group together, at first, as you were describing it, I'm thinking about the round tables in the turn of the last century in New York, where all these great writers are coming together and just kind of exchanging ideas. When you started to assemble this team, did you have an idea of what the topics were going to be? I mean, there's some obvious ones. I mean, there's, again, the food. You've got the Italian culture, American Italian culture, versus, I would imagine an Italian American goes to Italy today. I mean, they're in two different worlds.
Yeah.
Okay. And there's probably by the way, I did live in New Jersey for 4 months.
Oh, what town?
Englewood.
Oh, okay.
Englewood.
That's not too far from me. I'm just I live in Manhattan on the other side of the George Washington Bridge.
I know that very well. And by the way, I do miss New Jersey bagels.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And I do prefer, I grew up in Detroit, so I do prefer that pizza.
That's okay.
In any case, I digress. So you're bringing this group together. How did you then apportion the topics? Because there's so many of them. There's the music, there's the clothing, the food, the pinballs, the gambling. There's Tony he's a sociopath, but he, definitely he's tightly wound in some ways. You know?
He's very relatable. He's very, very human. I mean, the whole show is a send up of our own consumerist culture.
Yeah.
And I think that we can all see ourselves in those characters, which is why it's so effective.
Yeah. And how did you then decide to say, let's talk about this, and then bring the right collaborator together to say, okay, what do we need to know? What do we want to share? How did that flesh itself out?
It wasn't too hard. I knew essentially, if you go back and look at the initial pitch, it was a little more bathroom book and a little less, highfalutin's the wrong term, but a little less evolved than it turned out to be. And it just, once I started to get going and thinking about what I really wanted in it, it just turns out I'm more suited and better for the tone of the book. I knew everything about the show where I thought there was something interesting to say. And then I just started listing people who I thought would be great at it, whether I knew them or not. And some people said no or were busy. Most said yes. And I'm lucky just in being kind of a social, and this is a double-edged sword, a pathologically nice person, which isn't always a great thing to be. I know a lot of people, and a lot of people who are multifaceted. A person whose contributions to the book, hear people sound way more excited about his contributions than my own, is my friend Eddie McNamara. Eddie was someone who I didn't talk to that much for about 15, 20 years. We studied abroad in the UK together and didn't know one another, met on campus, these two East Coast kids. He was from Marine Park in Brooklyn. And after we met on this UK campus and we were fans of pro wrestling and New York sports and all this stuff, we bonded as these two weirdos on this British campus. And he became a Port Authority police officer and went through working search and rescue after 9/11, and then retired early and became a crime writer and a chef. So he was like, he had so many angles and his own lenses that he could bring to this book. I'm like, he's a great food writer. He's a great crime writer. He's a partner. And we become reinvigorated our friendship over the course of this project and are doing more things together. And his wife, Marav Devash, who writes about fashion, who's covered makeup and fashion for years in magazines like Allure and for brands like Revlon. I just know a lot of really talented people who don't get necessarily opportunities at the level of a Simon & Schuster published book. So I was like, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to bring lots of help, and they're going to be people that I like. It's as simple as that.
That's nice. I mean, that's what friends are for. And what has been the reaction to the book? I mean, it's just only just been released. And as I shared early on, I mean, you can't go onto YouTube without seeing a 10 best killing scenes of Tony Soprano or et cetera, et cetera. What has been the reaction so far of the community that just, lives and breathes everything Sopranos and just it's a part of their day-to-day appreciation?
I mean, it's early. So the initial very positive, thankfully, reactions came from trade. Library Journal, Kirkus, Publishers Weekly, they all wrote positive reviews, which made me happy. I mean, I live in the world of, like I said, creative marketing, so I'm always getting feedback. It isn't always great. On the podcast and with other things, I always crack up when I get my first 1-star review because someone's going to do it at some point. You're just like, if you want to have a bunch of 5 and 4 stars before that one hits, so it doesn't sting, which has usually been the case for me, and that's fine. But I always kind of smile when the first 1-star one comes in. I haven't gotten a 1-star one yet for this book. It's starting to get some traction on Sopranos Twitter and on some different sites, and reviews are starting to show up on Amazon and Goodreads. It's only been 13 days since the book came out. But the thing that was the most satisfying for me so far is that a gentleman named Dan, who goes by the alias Kevin Finnerty, which is Tony Soprano's own sort of alias from a large dream sequence in season 6. He was one of the creators of Sopranos Con, which although I haven't met him in person, I did attend 2 days of Sopranos Con in New Jersey last year. It was an amazing event. And I got him an early copy of the book because I wanted his perspective, and also because I wrote an essay on Sopranos Con that is largely positive. I thought it was a very great event that was certainly fueled by passion. And it ended up being the last piece that I wrote before I turned the book in last November. He's been very supportive and has helped to promote it. And everyone's been into it. It's going to take some trickle down with the Facebook groups where I'm seeing a little traction there and on Reddit. But the fact of the matter is most groups of people that have gotten together online around The Sopranos, they want to show clips. They want to repeat lines. And the level of, and this isn't knocking it because I do the same friggin' thing and I like it, but the level of discourse that's happening online about The Sopranos isn't generally the same level of appreciation as the book. But I think over the next couple weeks and months, we're going to get a really good trickle down effect. So far, I mean, short version, largely positive so far.
Fantastic. Well, it's interesting. I sound like a broken record. Anything that speaks about food and culture, I'm all in. I just love reading and immersing myself in other cultures and just the nuances between the cooking that becomes American Italian versus authentic Italian. It's just I'm all in for that. I am curious. You had mentioned early on about Twin Peaks in one of your opening statements, and I know Twin Peaks was developed by David Chase, or
David Lynch. David Lynch.
Yep. And I know it was, you've referenced it a couple times in the show, just the way the photography and the scenes and the imagery was used. I was really curious about The Sopranos, and I was reading the book. I mean, Chase was amazing, and the use of the camera angles, the dialogue. Is he just like this genius? I mean, can you actually learn that in school?
He learned it on the job. Like I think he was well into middle-aged by the time the show got picked up. I believe he'd wanted a career in movies, but he had worked on the Rockford Files for years for Kolchak the Night Stalker, which is a terrific show with Darren McGavin that ended up being the influence for the X-Files. A couple other shows of his own, but he was a TV journeyman. And there weren't really, aside from like, I guess at the time, maybe David E. Kelley and Stephen Bochco and Lynch, who got that big shot with Twin Peaks, there wasn't peak TV yet. There weren't television auteurs the way that the X-Files would spawn guys like Vince Gilligan, who went on to do Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, or Frank Spotnitz, who went on to to start Man in the High Castle with Amazon. It was a different world. It was much more the world of the yeoman. Even guys like Stephen J. Cannell, who did shows like Wise Guy and the A-Team, tons and tons of crime shows. It was a real sort of like yeoman's business. It was considered very different than cinema, and certainly not as highly regarded. And I hesitate to use highfalutin because it sounds pejorative, but it wasn't that world. And he kind of, this kind of just happened and he started it, but he had, a diverse array of skills from wanting to get into movies and from working on and making really smart TV for decades before this opportunity. And there's a really great essay in the book that I love by my friend Phil Dias-Nugent, who's written about movies and TV for AV Club, newspapers in New Orleans and all over, which really chronicles the evolution of David Chase's career and how everything that led up to The Sopranos. I mean, before The Sopranos, he had done, I think he produced the final Rockford Files movie. Towards the end of that, he worked on the latter seasons of Northern Exposure, but certainly nobody thought like, oh, this is the guy who's obviously going to change TV forever. It just came together. I mean, in a lot of ways, the book came together that way too. Not to compare the book to The Sopranos, but when you were talking about the food, you reminded me that originally I was just going to have a chapter on slang, on Italian slang, and we looked up a guy, a professor from Chicago, who lives out in Long Island, Fred Gardefa, and I ended up having a drink with him, and he's such a fascinating guy his life and his study is about Italian culture on the boot and the Italian immigrant experience. I ended up, I was like, why would I just talk about slang with this guy? We talked about, and there's a whole interview with he and I in the book about Italian American masculinity and the immigrant experience. And he's part of our long conversation about the finale. And it was just like, I reached out to this guy because I wanted to talk about Gabagool. And I'm like, why would I talk about Gabagool when I'm sitting across from this genius who lost family members to the outfit, to the mob in Chicago, and really is dedicated his life to the culture. So I had no idea who he was until I was already writing the book, and he ended up being a big part of it.
Fantastic. And the influences of The Sopranos and what we are seeing today, I mean, it's kicked off in 99, so to 2005, 2006-ish. I mean, so we've had a good 14 years beyond that now. How is The Sopranos and the work of David Chase, just given your research now and your consiglieres production of this book, how has The Sopranos continued to inform the type of work we're seeing today?
I think that in a lot of ways, it just opened up possibility and risk taking and chances. And it felt so premium. And then you had HBO, right? Who's always said it's not TV, it's HBO. And then you had all these other networks playing catch up and the streamers. So they raised the bar a lot, in terms of production, in terms of scope, but also in terms of ideas that on paper initially might have been, were really hard to sell. Well, it's this gangster, but he's depressed and on Prozac and he goes to see a shrink. It's like, all right, that sounds like Analyze This. Like but it's obviously not. It's this huge novelistic, multi-layered, complex thing. So it also, I think, gave permission to creators, and we see this with Sopranos alums like Matthew Weiner, who created Mad Men. He was sort of the David Chase of Mad Men after working on The Sopranos, for and with David Chase, to center shows around complex individuals who they aren't just one thing. They can behave compassionately and without humanity, completely repugnantly. And so it bucked convention. There are people, and there's always the discussion like, oh, what's with all the papers used to write, people, fans of The Sopranos have been disappointed because they want more whacking, less yakking. They do, because they assumed that The Sopranos was just a gangster show that was going to offer the kicks that the gangster movies have since the 30s, right? They didn't realize they were going to have to think or want to. They didn't want to be challenged. And The Sopranos ultimately I think it's a comedy, but it's a very challenging one. It really enabled creators and made an appetite and audience for the pocketbooks to open up for diverse palettes and multi-layered complex entertainments.
Very good. I've got two questions on my mind now before we kind of wrap it up, Nick. Is the book is out? You and your consiglieres you've written this wonderful book, great stories. Perhaps Tony Soprano is the obvious one, but if you could sit down with a character in the book, have a meal, have a conversation, who would that be?
Oh, wow. That's a really good question. I haven't thought too much about it. There's so many great ones. I think the character that I would probably get along the best with would be, there's fascinating people who are extremely dangerous, and I'd want to stay away from them. But Steve Buscemi's character in season 5, Tony Blundetto, who plays Tony Soprano's cousin, I think is a really terrific character who has noble intentions when he gets out of prison, and it's just he's a very tragic character because there's all of this gravitational pull back towards the life he had decided to leave. And I don't want to spoil anything for people who haven't necessarily seen the show yet, but he's a very moving, very relatable character and a terrific actor. But the show is just so full of multifaceted, terrific performances. But that's the one. I saw him once. I saw him once in a pizza place about 20 years ago when The Sopranos was on, and he gave me it was near Union Square, New York City. He gave me a dirty look, and I think he gave me a dirty look because I was talking to somebody about going tanning. And I said, blah, 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 blah. I can't do that. I got to go tanning. And I just saw Steve Buscemi look over at me like, seriously, dude?
Like, who are you?
And I didn't, and I stopped. I stopped going tanning after that.
There you go.
True story.
Okay, we're going to keep that in. Last question for your readers.
Mm-hmm.
What would you like for them to take away from this book?
Great question.
That's 2 in a row, by the way.
It is really what makes me happy. And so, a couple of people have said this to me recently. Like, I didn't get the book so everybody could be like, Nick, you and your friends are really smart. Like, does that feel good? Sure. But if someone who's seen the show before, maybe once, maybe twice, and they're a fan, and they read this book, and it brings them back to the show, and they can appreciate it with a new layer, and they can start to discover things that I missed for themselves. There are things that clicked for me on my 5th or 6th viewing of an episode in my life where I was like, oh my God, that's what he was up to. And I was able to write a piece. I guarantee that a book just as long as this one, with as many smart things that I think we've said, can be written without repeating a single idea from our book. So if I can inspire people to engage the material in a way that improves their lives and how they think about art and culture, that's all I could ask for.
Sounds good. Now, are you going to be on the edge of your seat for the Many Saints of Newark?
Yeah, I'm very, very curious. The book was originally going to come out in August, and it was ready because the movie was due in September. But with this horrible year that we've had with COVID, the movie got pushed. The book got pushed. So the book came out in December. The movie's coming out in March in theaters and on HBO Max. I'm very curious to see what they're going to do. All I know, I haven't read a script. I haven't seen a trailer. Nobody has. I don't even think they've released a poster. But what I want everyone to remember is the irony of that title. In the show, Livia Soprano, Tony's mother, referred to, her deceased husband, John Boy Soprano, as a saint. He's like, your father was a saint. And he wasn't. He was horrible. He abused people. He killed people. He was not a good man, like, at all. So when they say the Many Saints of Newark, it's certainly tongue firmly in cheek, deep irony. And I'm convinced that we're going to see very complicated and probably poor behavior from the characters.
Well, all mothers love their children. Nothing can go wrong there.
Yeah.
Nick, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the Success Insight podcast and just, hearing this journey that has unfolded and sharing this wonderful work with our listeners. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on, Howard. I hope people enjoy it and enjoy the show.
I certainly hope so. As I know, before the show starts, I've got to go back, and YouTube videos aren't enough anymore. I think I need to go back and binge watch over the holidays. Nick, if our listeners would like to learn more about you and your work, where are the best places for them to go?
My personal site, which I actually need to update with the books, is bracciacreative.work. That's BRACCIA creative.work. And just Nick Braccia, throw me in a search engine. The books will come, this book and my other book, Video Palace, which is written under a pseudonym, Maynard Wills. I edited it with a partner of mine. That's in kind of it's kind of Serial meets Stranger Things territory. So very different from this. You can find all that stuff on Amazon and any search engine. And I'm on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, all is Nick Braccia.
Fantastic. We'll definitely provide the backlinks to the website and to your social sites as well. And cool. Again, Nick, thank you so much for joining us on the Success Insight podcast.
My pleasure, Howard. Thanks for having me.
All right, folks, we've just been chatting with Nick Braccia. He is the author of Off the Back of the Truck, the unofficial contraband for the Sopranos' fan. And Off the Back of the Truck immerses fans further into the world of Tony Soprano, offering an in-depth analysis by Nick and his consiglieres, and is the must-have but didn't know you need a companion to the award-winning television series The Sopranos. So we hope you enjoyed today's podcast, and I do believe we are well over 100 podcasts this year, and I do believe this episode will be the crowning achievement on 2020 for us. So what a great way to end a very interesting year, and just to be able to get another view and creativity and how people are using their gifts to create some wonderful works of art. In this case, a book, Off the Back of the Truck. Folks, listen to us on successinsightpodcast.com. We're also on Facebook and LinkedIn at Success Insight Podcast. You can listen to us also on the podcast channels, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, and Amazon Music, Pandora, iHeartRadio, as well as on YouTube. Okay, folks, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there, have a phenomenal day. Take care of yourselves, your family, practice social distancing, wear a mask, and again, have a fantastic and safe end to your year, and hope you have a very healthy and happy new year 2021. I think we all deserve it by now. All right, folks, take care, and we'll see you next year on the Success Insight podcast. Take care now.
Success Insight is a production of Fox Coaching and First Story Strategies. Find us online, successinsightpodcast.com.